As much fun as Frasier's date turned babysitting is, Daphne and Bulldog's date is even better. Hello, and welcome to Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at episode number 14 of Frasier, entitled Can't Buy Me Love. It originally aired on January 20th, 1994. We're getting into that weird post-Christmas period of network television where it always seems new episodes are released seemingly at random until mid-February or early March, when they finally settle back into a regular schedule before going off air for the summer. This is episode production code number 112, which was the last production code before the Christmas episode. Next week, we'll jump ahead 4 production codes to 116, and won't actually line up with production code and release order episodes again until we hit episode number 18. While Frasier has episodes this week and next week, Seinfeld will be off the air because NBC does what it does. This makes the comparisons really hard to maintain. So I think I'm just going to plug in the Seinfeld average ratings for when we get back to Seinfeld having episodes again. For Frasier's part, this episode pulled in 27.1 million viewers. Not a super strong hold from last week's huge ratings, but still above the series average thus far and above the full season's average. Our opening this week is the red dot on top of the Space Needle again. All I'm really willing to predict at this point is we're going to stick with the 4 intro animations we've seen so far for the rest of the season. Beyond that, the staff may as well be pulling intros blindly out of a hat for how they've been showing up here. James Burrows is on direction duty this week, and my favorite writing team of Randberg and Flett is back on writing duties. In my opinion, contrary to most of the reviews on IMDb, they really deliver this week. We have a radio station scene opening this week, but it's not a guest caller scene. In fact, for the second time this season, we don't have a guest caller. Considering the sheer number of guest callers we've had between the Christmas episode and last week, the guest callers have more than earned a break for a week or two. Instead of a guest caller, this episode starts with Frasier and Roz outside the studio door. Which, by the way, the Bulldog poster seen during the Christmas episode is no longer visible there. We first saw this poster during the Christmas episode. Considering the production code wackiness here, it makes sense this poster isn't up, as this episode probably filmed prior to the Christmas episode. This is the only evidence that this episode takes place before the prior two. The last time we saw Bulldog in Frasier's studio was in episode 2. Where there was an issue with his booth, and he was forced to broadcast from Frasier's work area instead. This week, it's implied he always works in the studio after Frasier. And if either Roz or Frasier forget something, they get humiliated by Bulldog when they go back in. I seem to remember reading somewhere that going forward, Bulldog will always broadcast from the same booth as Frasier after his show. This makes sense, as with the exception of late night shows, there's no reason not to use the same booth for live shows. But it is a small continuity error worth mentioning. Before Frasier goes in to be humiliated by Bulldog, he asks Roz to go in for him. Roz says no, because last time she went in there, she was introduced as Martina Navratilova's girlfriend. This is a reference I didn't understand at all. As to whether this is due to being a somewhat dated reference, or just my lack of knowledge in tennis, I'm not sure. For those that don't know, Navratilova is considered to be one of the greatest tennis players of all time. She won numerous titles throughout the late 70s and all of the 80s. In 1981, she gained a U.S. citizenship, after losing her Czechoslovakian citizenship several years earlier. After becoming a U.S. citizen, she came out as a lesbian. She is also left-handed. So that's the history behind Bulldog's joke here. Niles brings over champagne to celebrate Maris being out of town, and we get an interesting background scene bit with Martin playing chess with himself. We've seen the chess set behind Frasier's couch in a lot of episodes, but I just always assumed it was Frasier's. It doesn't 100% go with the African chic Frasier's apartment cultivates, but it isn't out of place there either. This scene makes me think it's actually Martin's chess set. I like this, as it gives Martin a somewhat unlikely hobby, and is a nice character moment for him. This scene leads us into the meat of the episode, a bachelor auction, where Frasier and Bulldog are up for sale. I personally find these kind of episodes to be extremely fun, and even with the similarities to the season 6 episode of Cheers, where Sam and Woody went up for sale, that episode was fun too. But by that point in the series, we were getting a bit far into the Sam being old plot lines for it to be just a plain fun episode. On the other hand, this Frasier episode is exactly that, just plain fun. The first guy we see go up for auction is a fictional Seahawks player named TJ Smith. This episode aired in 1994. 3 years later, a guy named TJ Smith was born, who, in 2021, joined the NFL. Granted, he plays for the Vikings, as opposed to the Seahawks, but it's still an interesting bit of synchronicity. The actor playing the fictional TJ Smith is Brett Miller. Miller was pretty much only active during the 90s. He had 2 small spots in the 80s and did 2 shorts post-2001, but as otherwise, focused his acting career totally in the 1990s. He was in a decent number of 90s shows, including a number of soaps we've seen other Frasier guests come from. He's done episodes of Days of Our Lives, Sliders, Team Knight Rider, a truly awful Knight Rider spinoff, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and a 14-episode stint on The Young and the Restless. There are 2 other credited actors in this scene. The first is a stage manager played by Shauna Casey. She's done a few small parts, including a guest spot on an episode of Erie, Indiana. She got out of the TV and movie business in 2009, and since 2020 has become a stage playwright. The MC auctioning off The Bachelors is Kevin Levine. If you don't recognize the name as an actor, that makes sense. You may recognize him as a writer. The man's written a ton of television, much of it Frasier related, including episodes of Cheers, the original Cheers spinoff The Tortellis, Wings, Becker, and It's All Relative. He'll also write 7 episodes of Frasier, the first of which is episode 16 of this season. We'll discuss him more then. The auction scene is the last we see of Roz this episode, but she's delightfully unhinged in this scene. She really is just all the best parts of Rebecca Howe's character, turned into a more stable radio producer. And Roz isn't the only one to buy a date at the auction. Daphne wins the auction for Bulldog, after only bidding on him as a favor to Martin. Daphne and Frasier are both horrified at the prospect of her going on a date with Bulldog, and I actually end up feeling kind of bad for the guy. In Oops, Bulldog said his girlfriend of 8 years had left him, so this is probably the first new date Bulldog's had in the better part of a decade. Despite Bulldog being an undesirable bachelor at the auction, Frasier is won by a model for 5 times the price that Bulldog went for. The model's name is Christina Harper, and she is played by Claire Stainsfield. Stainsfield is a great choice to play a model, because she actually is a model. Or at least she was. She worked as a model through much of her teen years in both the UK and Canada, before moving to Hollywood to start an acting career. She never set fire to the acting world, but she scored a number of spots, including a 2-episode stint on Twin Peaks, an episode of The X-Files, and a recurring role on Xena, Warrior Princess, which seems appropriate for the 6-foot-tall actress. She'll return to this role in 2001 for a season 9 episode, and that will actually be her last acting appearance before she went into fashion design. Frasier is obviously very excited for his date with a model, but it doesn't pan out the way he's hoping, and he ends up stuck watching her 12-year-old daughter, Renata, played by Ashley Bank. Like Stainsfield, Bank has had an interesting career that didn't stay in one place. Born in 1982, Bank was a child actress from the very start, appearing in her first credited role at just 2 years old on an episode of Cagney and Lacey. Until the time when she was 12 and took this role on Frasier, she appeared pretty regularly in both television shows and movies. Most notably, she's been in Shane Black's Monster Squad and an episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Following this episode of Frasier, she appeared in one episode of VeggieTales before retiring from child acting. In 2008, she returned to acting and has appeared in a few spots here and there, but nothing substantial. In the early 2000s, she began work as a producer for a few years. Child actors are always a somewhat questionable proposition. They're just a little more unpredictable and unrefined than adult actors, by nature. And you never really know what you're going to get yourself into with them. With Bank, the casting directors chose well. Granted, she actually is a 12-year-old girl, but her teeth-grinding preteen behavior was spot on, and her interactions with both Eddie and Frasier were really enjoyable. As much fun as Frasier's date-turned-babysitting is, Daphne and Bulldog's date is even better. We get to see Daphne drunk for the first time, and the results are great. She's really mean to Bulldog, and again, I kind of feel bad for him. But at the same time, seeing her be a mean drunk is too much fun to really dwell on Bulldog's hurt feelings. Daphne's behavior here also makes me think she is just oblivious when it came to Frasier coming on to her last week. With her inhibitions down, thanks to the champagne, she still is just kind of naive. We get a true horror movie shot here as Bulldog is dragged out of the car by the other angry driver, a drunk Daphne, accidentally agitated in the parking lot. Drunk Daphne calls Bulldog Pitbull as he's dragged out of the car, then settles back into her seat. Upon the return of Frasier's date, he proceeds to blow any chance he had with her by believing everything her mischievous daughter said about her, which seems to all be a lie, and by a wide margin. Given this is how their not even a date ends, I'm extremely curious what the events are that will lead her to cross paths with Frasier again in season 9. Frasier has a pity party with Eddie after his date leaves, and it's the high point of Eddie for the episode. I actually had to stop and rewind this scene because I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Frasier takes a bite of the cookie dough after letting Eddie lick it. I like this a lot. Between getting to eat cheese puffs earlier and the cookie dough here, Eddie got all kinds of treats this episode, and Frasier showed that he and Eddie are secretly pals, even if they won't show it when anyone else is around. We get a great coda scene here too, with everyone piling into Bulldog's limo, including Eddie, and having a good time with everything poor Pitbull ordered before he was so unceremoniously dragged out into the night and left who knows where. We have an interesting variety of ties in this episode. Martin, Frasier, and Niles all wear one tie, and Frasier wears what I'm counting as a second tie with a bow tie. Martin and Niles' ties are both new. Martin's ties have thus far been what I would consider fairly standard ties, and that doesn't change here. Niles' tie is really different from what we've seen before. I called some of his other ties modern art ties, but those ones at least had some kind of pattern to them. This tie is cool looking, but has no pattern whatsoever. Frasier's tie is the return of the Thanksgiving tie. And his bow tie is new to the series, and I'm counting it as a new tie for Frasier. This brings us up to 21 ties for Frasier and 17 for Niles. Martin has sported 3 different ties thus far, meaning the next new tie we get will be the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. I really liked this episode. It's probably my favorite episode since Dinner Date. I find the Bachelor auction to be just such a fun idea, and the dates that spun off of it were delightful. I only had one small criticism this week, and that's the lack of Niles. He gets a fun scene at the start of the episode, but he's gone after that. I would have loved to see his reaction to hearing that Daphne was going on a date with Bulldog. We also didn't see the coffee shop again this episode, and I'm starting to wonder if we're ever going to see it again. We had 2 new locations with the backstage area of the Bachelor auction and the back of Bulldog's limo. But it would be really nice to see the coffee shop again. Those minor quibbles aside, this is a really strong episode. Everyone is in top form here. Roz and Eddie both have smaller roles, but they are excellent in them. Martin gets to show not one, but two other sides of himself by working for a charity and playing chess. Daphne is a delightful drunk, and Frasier shows, despite his psychology degree, he doesn't really understand people. Get to your favorite streaming site and watch this 9.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier before it's gone.